Even though there is a sad ending to the story of North African Christianity, there's still a lesson in it for us. I think as Christians of all cultures, but especially as Black Christians today, of the importance of why it is so important in evangelism and in theology and in ministry to really own your own culture, your own language, your own style, and to really express worship and theology in your own ways, rather than trying to just kind of impose or bring in something that else seems to be better. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Jude 3 Project. My name is Vince Bantu, and it is a pleasure and a blessing to be able to welcome you to a special ministry and podcast of the Jude 3 Project entitled the Bisrat. The word Bisrat is actually an ancient East African word in various languages that means the gospel, the good news. And this was a term that various East African Christians in antiquity and today used to reflect the good news of Jesus Christ and have been using for a long time. And we know that at Jude 3, we are centered around the gospel and proclaiming the good news and also equipping the body of Christ and also the Black church and Black community to be able to proclaim the Bisrat or the good news to our community in particular, and to equip the body to really be able to engage questions that are prevalent in our community, and maybe even objections or just concerns people have about the Bisrat, especially in the Black context. And so this podcast called the Bisrat will have a special focus on early African Christianity. So the Bisrat podcast, which is a part of the Jude 3 Project, is all about early African Christianity. And every week we're going to have a mixture of lectures, which is this episode, and also we will have some interviews and some conversations with other scholars where myself and other scholars will be able to engage specific questions that are really prominent in the Black community, especially with proclaiming the Bisrat in our context, with other religious communities and ideologies. And so today is actually the first of 4 lectures where I will just be sharing some resources and some surveys about early African Christianity that will help to really set the stage for just a general, basically church history survey in Africa before the modern period or before slavery. And the reason that we are going to be looking at African Christianity before colonialism is precisely because of one of the most common objections, that Christianity only entered into the lives of Black people through slavery and colonialism. And that's why we are focusing on the presence of the Bisrat among African peoples before that time period, to show that the Bisrat has been present among African peoples from the get-go. And we're going to be, each of these 4 lecture episodes or kind of mini lectures or surveys are going to be focused on the 4 major areas of Christianity in the African continent prior to colonialism. And one thing that's interesting as we, and very encouraging as we proclaim the Bisrat in our community, is that when you look at ancient African history, just even apart from Christianity, just African civilizations, especially in the first millennium, like in the first, in late antiquity or the early medieval period. When you look at Africa, the continent that we now call Africa in that time period, and when you look at Christianity, you're looking at the same thing. Or another way of saying that is, in order to study ancient African Christianity or ancient African history is to study African Christianity. What I'm trying to say is that Christianity was prevalent and eventually predominant in all of the earliest African civilizations. And so it wasn't just present as a minority, but eventually became the majority religion. And that was a free decision. It was not colonized. It was not imposed. It was not forced upon Africans. In fact, many times, as we're going to even see today, African people themselves were the ones standing up for the Bisrat, even to their own persecution and even sometimes death. And many times it was at the hands of Europeans. And so the 4 major ancient civilizations of Africa in the early church were primarily what's called North Africa, which is what we're going to talk about today, and then Egypt, and then Nubia, and then Ethiopia, or what was called Axum. So North Africa, Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia. And we're going to talk about a survey of how the Bisrat entered into and grew in those 4 areas in these 4 mini lectures in this Bisrat podcast. And today we are going to start off with talking about North Africa. So North Africa, in the ancient context, was a bit different than it is today. When we talk about North Africa in a church history context, that correlates to the modern nations of Libya and Tunisia and Algeria and Morocco. And really, the main center of that, though, is what we now call Tunisia, which was an ancient city named Carthage. And so Carthage was a massive city when it became part of the Roman Empire, was actually second only to Rome in terms of its size and its presence in the Mediterranean economy. But actually, if you look at what North Africa would have looked like in the modern period, I've already listed the modern nations that they're known by. And then even if you were to go back to like the early church, for example, in the first, second, third centuries, well, at that time period, what we now call North Africa was actually a colony, or had actually become colonized by the Roman Empire. And the names of them were different. They were basically Roman provinces or Roman colonia or colonies. And you had, for example, in modern Libya, that was a colony known as Byzacena. And then you also had what's called in Tunisia, or around Carthage, which was the major city of North Africa, was a region known as Africa Proconsularis. And then you also had Numidia and Mauritania, and there were two different Numidias and two different Mauritanias. And so there was about 7 or so Roman provinces in the time right before Christianity and during the early church. But if we go back even further to start off the story, even before Christianity came into North Africa, or even before the life and ministry of Jesus, if we look at the map in that time period, it actually looks very different. And as you see right here, there were really originally 4 kingdoms in North Africa that were unique and indigenous to North Africa before they became Roman colonies. And those 4 kingdoms were, going from west to east, Mauritania, far to the west, which would have been partly in Morocco and in Algeria. And then you would have had moving east, you would have had the kingdom known as Masicili. Then moving further east, then you would have had the kingdom known as Massili. And then finally, to the furthest east, in Carthage, that was the kingdom of Carthage, right? Now, if we were to rewind the clock even further, the Carthaginian kingdom actually themselves were indigenous North Africans, unlike the Romans, again, who colonized North Africa later. But they actually even themselves migrated and brought a distinct culture from the Near East, going back really far, like back to the 10th century BC. And so if you go back to the 10th century, that was actually when the Phoenicians that are mentioned in scripture, who were from the Near East, from the area near modern Lebanon and Palestine, the Phoenicians, some of them actually migrated over into Carthage, and they actually created a Phoenician civilization that was later known as Punic. So if you've ever heard the word Punic before, even the word Punic is related to the word Phoenician, similar letters. And so the Carthaginian kingdom was settled 1,000 years before Christianity by Phoenicians who came to modern day Tunisia and built the city of Carthage. And they were North Africans, but they were also culturally distinct from the indigenous North Africans who had been there even before the Punics. And so these are the people that are properly known as Imazirin. And Imazirin is the modern name that these people groups, native North Africans, still go by. Now, you might know them by their colonial name that has been put upon them, and you'll more often see in scholarship, which is the word Berber. But I want to encourage you to stop using that word, because that is a Western and a Roman imposition put upon them that even in scholarship is used to refer to the native indigenous North Africans. So you will hear the word Berber, but I would encourage you to use their own name that they still today use for themselves, which is Imazirin. And so in North Africa, you had 2 cultures that were living side by side, and to a large extent, influenced one another. They traded with one another. They lived next door to each other, but at the same time, they were distinct. And so again, Carthage was the territory of the Punics, and they spoke the Punic language, and they had slightly different gods and goddesses, and slightly different culture, different kingdom. And then the kingdoms of Masicili, and Mauritania, these were the indigenous North Africans that spoke the Imazirin language, and they were themselves Imazirin. Now, The kingdoms of Masicily and Massili in the 3rd century BC united, and they became known as the kingdom of Numidia. You might have heard the name Numidia before, and that actually happened in the midst of when the Romans began to come into and create or colonize and absorb these various North African regions, which was a process that took a few centuries, and by the time of Christianity had become complete. But what had happened was the Numidians under King Massinissa, who is known as like one of the most famous North African kings in history, was actually teaming up with another leader in Carthage known as Syphax. And they were actually engaging with warfare with the Romans, who at this time in the 3rd century were not the power that they would have been in after the time of Julius Caesar and in the time of Christianity. But what had happened was Massinissa, who was the king of a united Numidia, who brought together Masicily and Massili, had actually switched sides and joined with the Romans against Syphax and actually fought against the Carthaginians and helped to defeat them. And in return, he was promised to be supported by the Roman Empire. But essentially what happened was Numidia became what's known as a client kingdom of the Roman Empire. So this was one of the first examples, probably in history, of Europeans coming into Africa and doing the divide and conquer game, and in exchange for resources, Africans turning against each other, and then that resulting ultimately in the colonization of Africa. And so that continued to happen in Numidia, and as well as Carthage, as Rome eventually became victorious in the Punic Wars after three sets of them. And so Carthage had become a client colony of the Roman Empire, and Numidia became a client kingdom, but eventually in the 1st century became a Roman colony. And then the same thing happened for the kingdom of Mauritania, which is in modern day Algeria and Morocco, and they also became a client kingdom after the time of King Juba in the 1st century. So by the time of, basically what had happened after that was now from that point on, right around the time that Christianity came on the scene, the Roman Empire had just finished kind of absorbing these ancient North African kingdoms into becoming Roman colonies. And at that point, you started to see a whole lot more Roman culture, Roman cities being built all throughout North Africa and, in Numidia, Roman roads and a lot more Latin culture and Roman administrative aspects being put into North Africa. And a lot more Latin speaking, but the indigenous Imazirin and also Punic civilizations still continue to thrive. And so by the time of Christianity, you had 3 major language groups and cultures that were living in North Africa that to a large degree were interdependent and influenced one another, but at the same time were still distinct. And those 3 languages and cultures were Latin/Roman, Punic, and Imazirin, which is again erroneously called Berber oftentimes. So these were the 3 different languages. And on this next slide, you can see pictures of the native indigenous Imazirin language and civilization. Right here, you see these sacrificial stela or towers. You used to seeing the taller ones of Egypt and Ethiopia or in Nubia even, but these smaller ones were dedications to Punic and Imazirin gods, like Tanit, who is the most famous probably of Punic and Imazirin gods and goddesses, and it was associated with the moon. So if you notice the large stela there has a moon disk on top of it, and these are often called madrasins. And these madrasins had a lot had to do with infant protection of infant health. And so, but you can see examples here on both of these madrasins of the native Imazirin language, or again, the Berber language, but the Imazirin language is written here. And actually on the right there, you see picture of Massinissa on some numismatic evidence or a coin of Massinissa. And also those are thought to be his bones that are from his royal madrasin or tomb. Now, you can see right there an image of King Massinissa, and it is on a coin, but that kind of leads me to another point that I think is an elephant in the room that we always need to address, especially as Black people, which is, are we talking about Black people here? And this is a very controversial issue, but as the physical evidence itself would show, I would argue that no, that people in North Africa were not Black, both by modern definitions of what Black means or by ancient definitions, because to be sure, ancient people did have categories like Black and white. And the North Africans would often talked about themselves as being a distinct people from black. Now, let me be very clear. This does not mean that they were white or European, but they were what they are today. They were brown people, and they were from a North African, Imazirin, Asiatic racial group that was neither European nor sub-Saharan African. And this is also not analogous to, kind of someone like myself or other people, Obama or Bob Marley, who are multiracial, a mixture of sub-Saharan African and European. We're not talking about that either. We're talking about a distinct racial group in North Africa that's neither European nor sub-Saharan African. And the evidence itself shows it. In fact, these madrasans here are actually from Hippo, which is from one of the most famous theologians in North African church history, Augustine. And at that same site, there's actually mosaics present there that show North Africans that are from Hippo depicting themselves with very fair skin and straight hair. And then next to them, they actually have what was called an Ethiopian slave, which just meant black person, and we'll get more into that. And so even from that mosaic and other ones like it, you can see the very clear racial distinction between North Africans and Egyptians, and then sub-Saharan Africans, which were they were two different racial groups. But at the same time, these are still Africans, and again, they're not Europeans, but that's something that we need to clarify. As I said, though, these are still North Africans, and they had their own indigenous North African culture, and we're seeing some of the few evidences of that. But as Christianity, and I'll make a point about this later, but as Christianity continued to grow and spread in North Africa, it was largely strongly connected to the Latin language and Roman culture and administrative and ecclesiastical structures. And so we'll get into more of the implications of that. But not long after, you have mentions in Scripture, even itself, in Acts 2 about Libyans being present at Pentecost, and Simon of Cyrene, and then also his sons who also went on to spread the gospel. So we already see that the beginnings of North African Christianity, places like Cyrene and Carthage and others, begins in the Bible itself. And it makes sense because there's a large Jewish community there, like Simon himself. And just like in every other direction, Christianity originally spread along Jewish communities and then went from Jewish Egyptians, Jewish Ethiopians, Jewish Persians, Jewish Indians, Jewish Romans and Greeks into Gentile populations in those same regions. But in North Africa, very quickly after the time of the New Testament, we get some of the earliest examples of Christian theologians and figures in history. And probably two of the best examples of that, at the turn of the 3rd century, around the year 200, is, first of all, Tertullian, who lived in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries, one of the first theologians to write in the Latin language. And he was one of the first ones to use the term Trinity, and he wrote on a plethora of ethical and theological issues. And he was actually also associated with a particular Christian group that had started in Asia Minor, but actually had some of its largest followings in North Africa. And so in some ways, you could say that this was a largely North African Christian movement known as Montanism. And many people would say that Montanism, in a way, is almost like an ancient version of Pentecostalism, because the Montanists had a strong emphasis on the Holy Spirit. It was actually officially called the New Prophecy, is what they called themselves. And so Tertullian did really attach himself to a unique style of Christianity in some ways that was rooted in North Africa. And also another example of early North African Christianity is the famous martyrs Perpetua and Felicity. And Perpetua was a noblewoman who many people think that she actually wrote the biography that tells the story about how her and the servant woman Felicitas were both, with another group of people, were persecuted and eventually thrown into the Carthaginian Colosseum, which is a picture there, right there in the middle. And that's a dedication to them, to Perpetua and Felicity, who were martyred at that Colosseum in Carthage. But that's, again, we cannot understate the significance of the fact that what is probably the first Christian text written by a woman was a North African woman, was a Carthaginian, Imazirin woman, North African woman, who wrote her own story. And even in it, there is all these empowering examples of how she's going to her death, for the gospel. And she also is likely connected to the Montanists or the New Prophecy, because she has all these amazing visions from the Lord, and she goes to her death bravely. But even her father tries to stop her and visit her in jail, and he even starts to try to physically abuse her, and she still resists his authority. And it's a powerful example of women, African women, standing up for the gospel and going to their death. Now, we also need to pause and think about who is the one doing the killing right now. Who are the ones that are initiating these persecutions? Well, at the turn of the 3rd century, around 200, Septimus Severus was initiating, the Roman emperor was initiating strong persecutions of Christians. But it's interesting to me that we get examples in the early church of Roman emperors and Roman leaders persecuting Christianity in the Roman Empire. North Africa, this part was a part of the Roman Empire, it was a colony. And it's interesting to me that the initiators of persecution are Roman leaders, and some of the most famous stories we see of people who resist that persecution and resist those attempts to convert are actually North Africans and people from Carthage. And we'll talk later in the next episode about Egypt. And so this flies in the face of the story and the narrative that we hear in our community, oftentimes by people who are resistant to Christianity, that Christianity is from the white man and Christianity came from the Roman Empire and they invented Christian doctrine. And they forced it upon Africans. When you look at North Africa in the 2nd and 3rd century, you get the exact opposite impression. Because number one, when we look at people like Tertullian, we see that this North African theologian in the 200s, over a century before the Roman Empire became allegedly Christianized, that there was already North African theologians like Tertullian who were already arguing for the Trinity and for the full lordship of Jesus Christ. So Christians, especially African Christians, already believed in the lordship of Jesus Christ long before the Roman Empire decided to allegedly jump on board with it. And not only that, but you have martyrs like Perpetua and Felicity who are bravely going to their death. They're dying for the gospel. So Christianity is not being imposed upon Africans in North Africa in the 3rd century. But on the flip side, African Christians are willingly going to their death because they refuse to renounce the Lord Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. So again, this is why this history is so pertinent to know. Now, continuing on with North African Christianity, the issue of martyrdom and suffering for the faith was another very important theme in North African Christianity. And in fact, in the later 3rd century and in the 4th century and even into the 5th, that would continue to be a very strong point of contention and debate in the North African church. And because what had happened was you had churches that were, or you had Christian leaders in North Africa that were basically debating, well, if you have somebody who is being, like Perpetua Felicity, that are being martyred for their faith, right? But a lot of times, there were a lot of Christians who didn't go out like a soldier like Perpetua Felicity did, but sometimes they would renounce Christ, or they would, say that they weren't a Christian, or they would choose to buy a certificate in order to, not have to sacrifice, or they would sacrifice to the Roman gods. There was all different reactions, as you can imagine, just like even today, there's different reactions to Christian persecution, and people make different decisions. And so, but the question that came up is, in the church that the church was debating in North Africa was, if you have Christians who renounce Jesus in times of persecution, but then when the persecution kind of like ended or declined, then they wanted to come back to church and repent of what they had did and say, oh, I didn't mean it. I was just trying to save my life. The question was, are they still saved? Are they a part of the church, or are they now condemned? Like Jesus said, if you deny me before men, I'll deny you before the Father. That was a strong debate. And at first in the 3rd century, it was mainly a debate between the bishop of Carthage, who his name is Cyprian. So Cyprian was probably the next major North African theologian after the time of Tertullian. And one of the most famous texts that Cyprian wrote was one that was called On the Unity of the Church. And it was when he was presenting the side of the argument that was saying that, well, we can forgive and we can bring back in Christians who had renounced Jesus to save their life, and we can forgive them. And so, but what happened was there were some Christians who didn't agree with that, and they were more strict about it and say, no, they're not Christian anymore. They can't be in the church. They can't have communion. And so they were led by a person named Novatian, and Novatian was another, bishop in North Africa at that time who they were arguing about this. And Cyprian, even though they were arguing about the issue of whether or not to forgive the people who had renounced Jesus, a big part of the issue was also the authority of the church of Carthage. And that was really Cyprian's one of his big deals of saying that, the biggest issue is actually the fact that y'all are trying to start a separate church. So that was another question of like, is there going to be one church authority in North Africa, or are there multiple ones? But you can see this here when Cyprian is critiquing the Novatian and his followers, when he says, these doubtless, he's talking about now the people that repented, these people doubtless they imitate and follow, who despising God's tradition seek after strange doctrines and bring in teachings of human appointment, whom the Lord rebukes and reproves in his gospel, saying, you reject the commandment that you may keep your own tradition. This is a worse crime than that which the lapsed, and when he talks about lapsed, that's he's talking about the people who had lapsed into apostasy and then came back. But he's saying that the Novatianists, the people who were saying that they're unforgiven, he's saying that that's an even worse crime than that which the lapsed seem to have fallen into, who nevertheless, standing as penitents for their crime, beseech God with full satisfactions. So this issue continued to rage in North Africa, and it really, again, set the stage for, is there going to be one church that's in charge, or can there be multiple churches? Now, going into the 300s, into the 4th century, it was interesting because there was like the same issue, but different people now and different names. In the 4th century, there was a person named Donatus who was making similar arguments, because in the early 300s, right before Constantine's alleged conversion, the Emperor Diocletian was persecuting Christians worse than any Roman emperor before him. And this was it's called the Great Persecution in the early 300s. It was the worst persecution in the history of the church, in the Roman Empire, that is, because again, in other empires, there were other things going on. But Donatus argued the same thing that Novatian did almost a century before him, that if you renounce Christ, you're not saved anymore. And the Donatists were his followers, and that was a major movement, especially in North Africa. It wasn't, it wasn't only in North Africa, but kind of like Montanism, most of the followers of Donatism were in North Africa. So in a way, there's a degree to which you could say that Donatism was a North African religion. Now, this gets into the time period of the most famous North African Christian in the history of North African Christianity. I don't even got to tell you the brother's name because you already know, Augustine. And so Augustine is one of the most influential theologians in the history of Western Christianity. It's interesting, he had more of an effect on European Christianity than he actually did on African Christianity, which we'll talk about later. But Augustine lived in the late 4th and early 5th century, and he wrote many different texts like City of God, where he's the first Christian to make an argument for just war, and also a lot of kind of church-state relations. He also wrote his Confessions that talks a lot about his own spiritual life and his conversion. But he also wrote a lot against the Donatists. That was one of his biggest enemies in his whole career as the bishop of Hippo, which again, it's called Hippo Regius because it was the capital city of Numidia, even going back to the Numidian time period. And so, like Cyprian did in the 200s, Augustine in the 300s and 400s, his main argument against the Donatists was actually not that they were being so strict against these people who had rejected, Christ and then tried to come back. But it was, again, about church authority. His main issue, like Cyprian, was how dare you have a separate church? There's only one church, and it was the Church of Carthage that was also in connection with the Church of Rome. So you see here, this is Augustine also arguing against the Donatists when he says, but if anyone who has it in his power to receive baptism within the Catholic Church prefers from some perversity of mind to be baptized in schism. When he says baptized in schism, he's talking about being baptized by the Donatists. And he's calling the Donatists schismatics, and there's one church, and it's the Catholic Church, which it's not the same as saying Roman Catholic Church like in our days, but he's just saying the universal church, which for Augustine was centered in Rome, and also its extension of authority in Carthage that he was a part of. And actually, that picture there is actually a Donatist baptismal, because this issue is so tense in the North African church that the Catholics and the Donatists had separate churches, they had separate baptismals, they had separate bishops, separate everything. And that's actually from a city named Timgad, which was a Roman city in what's now Algeria or in ancient Numidia. And that was actually one of their biggest strongholds of Donatists was in the city of Timgad. And that's actually where they had their own baptismal. And so anyway, Augustine is saying that these Donatists have a perversity of mind to be baptized in schism. Even he afterwards bethinks himself to come to the Catholic Church because he is assured that that sacrament will profit him, which can indeed be received but cannot profit elsewhere. Beyond all question, he is perverse and guilty of sin, and the more flagrant in proportion as it was committed willfully. For that he entertains no doubt that the sacrament of baptism is rightly received in the church, he means the Catholic Church, not the Donatist Church, and is proved by his conviction that it is there that he must look for profit even from what he has received elsewhere. And so again, you see that Augustine's main issue here is not actually whether or not people are being too strict against the lapsed, but it's actually about proper church authority. So this leads into another very controversial debate in North African Christianity, which is that, basically was Augustine kind of like representing the more like official Catholic Church that had its North African leadership centered in Carthage, but then in turn was also officially under the Roman bishop at that time. And then was the Donatists more of like an indigenous North African Christianity? And was there like kind of a cultural or even racial or ethnic element to this debate? That's a very controversial topic in early Christian studies. I just want to let you know, even PhDs in early churches do not agree on that question. And I think there's a lot of elements to it. We don't have time to get into all of this today, but I will just kind of quickly come out and say that my 2 cents on it, and when you look at the evidence, is actually that I think that there are scholars who maybe took it too far and called the Donatist movement like a nationalist movement, and I think that's taking it too far, and that's a modern kind of anachronistic interpolation. But I would say that there is an ethnic sense to it in the sense that Donatism was really kind of more local to the African community, and it was associated with North Africa, and it was often called like an African movement by some of its leaders and also by Augustine himself. In some of his letters against some of the Donatist leaders, he himself is acknowledging the fact that people associate Donatism as being a more North African religion. So I think that, yes, it's true that there were Catholics, so to speak, and Donatists in North Africa, Catholics like Augustine, but I also do think that the evidence shows that people, even Augustine himself, associated Donatism with being kind of a more North African religion. Now, why am I bringing this up? I'm bringing this up to say this is another lesson we can learn as we're doing apologetics in today's world. Because what you have here is you have a theologian like Augustine who himself was a North African. He was an Imazirin, or he was actually he was a Punic, because he speaks about his mother being Punic, and he has a little bit of ability to know the Punic culture, but he was really more educated in Milan under Ambrose and Cicero, and his thinking and culture is a lot more Latin and Roman in terms of his style, and his theology and his philosophy is a lot more European or Roman. So his church structure and his theology and who he was kind of in league with in this context was more, again, the authority in Rome. And he really worked to suppress the more indigenous North African church tradition. Now, when you add that together with the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, North African Christianity with people like Tertullian and Augustine and Cyprian, they did not really write in the indigenous languages like the Imazirin or even the Punic languages. And the architecture of churches and baptismals was following the Roman style. The point I'm making is that the nature of Christianity in North Africa was extremely Romanized, and even Augustine's thought process was highly Romanized and Latinized. And even the one maybe example to a degree, even though they were writing in Latin too, but even in the sense of just being regionally connected to the North Africa, the one example of a maybe more indigenous North African religious community like the Donatists was largely suppressed, not only by the Roman Church, but even by the supporters of the Roman Church in North Africa. And so the lesson that I think we can learn from this is that we are still dealing with this issue in modern forms today in the Black church and Black community, where our indigenous styles of preaching, our indigenous styles of doing theology, our indigenous styles of worship and doing church are often looked down upon and disrespected by even Christians in the dominant culture, saying that it's not intellectually respectable or that it's not intellectually or spiritually profound. But I think, and even sometimes some of us in our community, especially if we go into white seminaries or white spaces or denominations, we will sometimes even imbibe that same self-hatred and think that our own indigenous Black church traditions are not spiritually and theologically rich and profound, which they are. And we will sometimes imbibe that same kind of self-hatred and think that white theology, white doctrines are better. And I think that there is a degree to which many North African Christians and theologians fell prey to that. And I would say that that is one of the reasons that North African Christianity ultimately did not survive. Because what happens later, after the time of Augustine, there was a little period where the Vandals, kind of this Gothic culture from Central Europe and the Iberian Peninsula came in and conquered North Africa for a century, but then they got kicked out by Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. But then in the 7th century, that was the death blow to North African Christianity. And what happens in the 600s, we all know, the rise of Islam. So Islam grows in the Arabian Peninsula and consolidates power, and then it comes over and conquers Egypt quickly in 642, and then into Libya, and then eventually around the turn of the 8th century, around the year 700, the city of Carthage, the ancient, almost 2,000-year-old civilization of Carthage, is destroyed. by the Rashidun Caliphate in the late 7th century. And so it was very soon after that you don't see any more evidence or any more mention of Christians in North Africa going already into the 8th, 9th, 10th century. This church tradition that lasted for almost 700 years, from the 1st century, from the beginning of the church, all the way up until the 7th century and the rise of Islam. There's a 700-year church history of Perpetual Felicity, of Tertullian, of Cyprian, of Augustine that lasted for so long, and then almost just quickly disappears and is just completely covered over with Islam, and it disappears. And why is that? I would present to you today, and I think that by the end of this series of episodes, you'll be able to understand a little bit more when we compare some of these pieces of evidence to like Egyptian or Ethiopian Christianity, for example, who are other ancient Christianities that do survive to the present and whose communities still have lasted centuries of European oppression and colonialism and of Islamic persecution and all of that kind of stuff. They still survive. And the reason why is because they were much more connected to their own local language and culture and theology, and built their own indigenous tradition in a way, to a degree that the North Africans really didn't do as much. And so again, that's even though there is a sad ending to the story of North African Christianity, there's still a lesson in it for us, I think, as Christians of all cultures, but especially as Black Christians today, of the importance of why it is so important in evangelism and in theology and in ministry to really own your own culture, your own language, your own style, and to really express worship and theology in your own ways, rather than trying to just kind of impose or bring in something that else seems to be better. But the last thing I will end with, that is another name that we need to know, and another unspoken name that needs to be more known, is the name of Queen Kahina. So Queen Kahina was the queen of Numidia, and who worked again as a Roman colonia in the 7th century. And she was a Christian queen, like most at that time in the 600s, most North Africans were Christians. And she actually successfully fought off the Muslims initially. So as I said, even though the Muslims conquered North Africa and destroyed Carthage and then rebuilt the city of Tunis as an Islamic kind of center in North Africa and on the continent, initially, though, Queen Kahina was successful in repelling and pushing back the Islamic forces back. She pushed them all the way from Carthage into Libya and won an initial victory. So again, even though they initially came back and defeated her army and defeated Carthage, it's just such a powerful image to think about, that when Muslims came into North Africa, they came in conquering with the sword. What they encountered in Egypt, which we'll talk about next, and also in North Africa, they encountered a bunch of African Christians who were even willing to fight and defend their homeland and to maintain it being a Christian kingdom. And it was led by a North African Christian queen named Queen Kahina. And so this, again, just flies in the face also, for example, of anybody in our community that is going to tell us something like, well, Islam is the real religion of the black man. We're Moors, and we all came from the Moors, and that's our ancestor. We were all Muslim, and then Christianity was imposed on us later. Like, nah, bro, look at the record. Actually, it's the complete flip. If you really want to say we're Moors, and you really want to talk about Moors and North Africans, which also Moor is an offensive term as well, like Berber. If you want to talk about Imazirins, if you want to say that we're all from like Imazirin land, okay. Well, let's go back to Imazirin land. Let's go back to Numidia and Carthage and Mauritania. Let's see what was going on there even before Islam even existed. And what we will find is that the so-called Moors or the Imazirin, like Augustine, Tertullian, Perpetual Felicity, and Queen Kahina, were Christians. And they were freely Christians. And on the flip side, when Islam comes in at the end of the 600s, it comes in by the sword, and it comes in conquering and enforcing. So Islam is actually what became in by force in Africa, whereas Christianity came in freely by some of the earliest apostles and early people like Simon of Cyrene. There's no imposition. And in fact, on the flip side, they actually died for the faith, like Perpetual Felicity, against the Europeans, the Romans, who were trying to impose paganism and polytheism. The last thing I'm going to mention to illustrate the literal Christian foundations of North Africa is the fact that on the right here next to Queen Kahina, you see an image of the Mosque of Kairouan. And Kairouan is one of the most sacred sites for Islam in the continent of Africa. This is the oldest mosque on the continent of Africa, and this was built soon after the conquest of Tunis, or the building of Tunis and the conquest of Carthage. But they built it so quick that they used a lot of the same material and bricks that they just destroyed from Roman temples and from Christian churches. So if you look at that central image, that is actually a pillar inside the mosque of Kairouan, the oldest mosque in Africa. But notice what's on that pillar. It's a cross, because they took material to make their mosque out of churches. And so this is a literal visual reminder that after Islam came into Africa and enforced itself and conquered the indigenous Imazirin people, that they built their literal mosque on Christian foundation. Islam was built in Africa on literal Christian foundations. You have a cross in the oldest mosque on the continent of Africa. So just that image speaks to us about the fact that, yes, Islam has a very long track record among African peoples, but more often than not, it entered through conquest, and that continues on into West Africa and Central African history as well. Whereas, but this image also shows us a deeper truth, which is that even before Islam even existed, that the cross of Jesus Christ was being symbolized to depict the faith of North African people in the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ that had freely come in the first century and had freely thrived and shaped North African civilization and language and literature for almost a millennium. So thank you very much for your time in this podcast, in this first episode of the Bisrat podcast. And I would love to continue to chop it up with you. Hit me up if you have any questions about North African Christianity or just want to continue any of these topics in general. And we will see you at the next episode of the Bisrat podcast. God bless you.
Here's what we know at Boost, that keeping up with the marketing demands of today is almost impossible. You need graphics, you need video, you need social media strategy, and a whole lot more to stay relevant and keep up. That's why we launched Boost under this whole thought of being unlimited. We're going to come up with a package for you that has unlimited graphics, unlimited video, social media support, and more so that we can be an extension of your team and help you stop focusing on all the marketing stuff that needs to get done and instead be focusing on the message that you need to get out and the passion that you have for the world. Go to boostmedia.co to find and build your package so that we can get something set up that's custom for you, that works for you, that fits in your budget and helps you to accomplish your goals. Can't wait to talk to you soon.